Let's rewind the clock to 6 years before the birth of Christ. Picture yourself standing right in the belly of the beast Rome itself. You aren't just a face in the crowd. Your name commands respect and fear in the corridors of power. You have used your wealth to buy a seat at the table with the men who draw the maps of empires. Your entire household operates like a well-oiled machine, strictly adhering to the traditions of the elders. And on this specific day, the stars seem to have aligned perfectly for your agenda. Standing right there in front of you is your own flesh and blood, your daughter. She is young, maybe 16 or 17 years of age. But make no mistake, every single second of her life has been manufactured and engineered for this one specific event. They educated her just enough to be useful, but kept her mind completely under lock and key. Since she was a baby, she has been programmed to submit to authority without asking a single question. The ceremony is executed with military precision. The omens in the sky look good, the religious leaders give their stamp of approval, and the alcohol is flowing through the crowd like a river to keep the masses sedated. The entertainment is relentless and hypnotic. Everyone is coming up to shake your hand, telling you what a great job you have done, fulfilling your duty as a patriarch of the system. But once the vows are exchanged and the party starts to die down, there is a heaviness in the atmosphere that just won't leave. It is the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. You watch as she is quietly separated from the festivities and led away from the lights and the laughter. She turns to look at you one last time, and in that split second the veil is lifted, and you see the truth in her eyes. You see pure terror and confusion, a silent plea for help hanging in the air between you, but the laws of the land have tied your hands and sealed your lips. Now understand this, what happens next isn't some conspiracy theory or enemy propaganda. This is documented in the cold, hard text of their laws, hidden behind fancy religious language. The truth of this evil practice survived in fragments of old plays and scripts that the government censors failed to burn or bury. For nearly 500 years, the marriage laws of this empire hid a dark requirement that turned a bride's wedding night into a ritualistic transaction, a deal made between her body and demonic entities. Before a woman could officially belong to her husband, she had to be violated by men who claimed they were acting on behalf of the heavens. They gave this abuse a sterile official name and backed it up with theological arguments so that nobody could dare speak against it. And this wasn't happening in the back alleys. It was protected and defended by the most powerful institutions of the ancient world. The young women who were fed into this machine got absolutely nothing in return for their sacrifice. They had no voice, no rights, and no way out of the trap. We are about to pull back the curtain on how this system of control really operated. We are going deep into the legal statutes that treated human beings like property to be traded on a market. We are stepping into the secret chambers built for rituals that the history books try to ignore or whitewash. We are going to look at the doctors and philosophers who tried to warn us, hiding the truth in their writings and hoping the authorities wouldn't catch them. By the end of this broadcast, you will understand exactly why fathers looked the other way while their daughters were dragged into the temples. You will see why brave women risked execution to leave warnings in stone carvings and art because it was too dangerous to write it down. Before we expose these dark statutes and break down the programming, go ahead and represent your city and nation in the comment section right now. Because this goes way beyond ancient Rome. This shows us the depths of human depravity when the legal system turns abuse into an act of worship. It reveals the terrifying reality of what happens when society accepts evil as a necessary part of the law. So put yourself back in the shoes of that Roman father for a moment. The party is over. The last guests are stumbling home in the dark, and you are standing there frozen while the servants clean up the broken glass and spilled wine. The band has packed up their gear and left the building. The silence is deafening. The groom is barely standing wasted on wine, laughing at the crude jokes his buddies are making about what he thinks is going to happen tonight. But he isn't the one who gets her first. Suddenly, two women appear out of the shadows coming from the temple district. They are dressed in holy robes, acting polite and speaking with soft voices, but it is all a mask. They aren't asking for permission. They aren't there to make a deal. The law decided this fate long before your daughter was even born. You see, marriage in this system was never about love or affection. It was a cold, calculated business transaction. You had the woman on one side, and on the other, a group of men who owned her life completely. First, it was the father calling the shots, picking the husband handling the money, and acting as the gatekeeper for her life. Then the husband took over that same absolute power the second they said, "I do." The legal term for this total ownership was manus. Under the statutes of the time, a woman was never free. She just passed from one master to another, from her father's grip to her husband's grip. But there is a sick twist in the fine print that nobody tells the bride. The handover of power isn't instant. There is a gap between the father's authority and the husband's authority. And the religious leaders stepped right into that gap. According to their laws, the bride had to be purified before she could enter her new home. You see that specific word pop up over and over again in the ancient legal texts. Purification. It sounds innocent enough on paper, like some nice religious ceremony with incense and chanting, but it doesn't sound like what it actually is: sheer terror and a young girl being dragged away from her own wedding to be used by the system. But you have to dig deeper past the surface level history they teach in schools and really examine the ancient statutes. You need to go back to the 12 tables, that so-called foundational legal code every Roman citizen had to memorize by heart. If you look closely, buried deep within the boring regulations about inheritance laws and property transfers, there is something sinister hiding in plain sight. There is a single obscure passage that completely shatters the mainstream narrative and reshapes everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. This statute explicitly declares that no freeborn woman from a respectable high-status family could enter into a lawful marriage without first undergoing a ritual purification administered by the self-proclaimed guardians of divine will. The text is intentionally vague, offering zero details on the procedure. It doesn't tell you where it happens. It simply establishes absolute authority over the individual. That specific title, Guardians of Divine Will, was the exclusive property of a shadowy priestly order directly connected to the worship of Bonadea, the so-called good goddess. This wasn't a fringe group. Her cult had infiltrated every layer of Roman society. You couldn't walk down the street without seeing her statues adorning public spaces. Her altars were flooded with daily offerings from the deceived masses. The annual festivals drew enormous crowds, blindly participating in the rituals. On the surface, the official narrative claimed her domain was fertility, the protection of women, and the general welfare of the state, a perfect cover story. But behind the curtain, unofficially, these priests had secured legal immunity to access the most vulnerable and defenseless category of people in Rome: teenage brides. To really grasp how Rome justified this sick arrangement, you have to wake up to how Roman religion actually operated in the real world. It bore absolutely no resemblance to faith as we understand it in 2026. Roman worship was a cold, hard system of exchanges. You provided something of value to the entity. In return, the gods were contractually obligated to reciprocate. The Romans offered up grain for harvest, trading physical goods for supernatural favor. They slaughtered cattle to guarantee military triumph. They poured out wine to buy safety and divine protection for their travels. Every single ritual was a business deal, a spiritual bargain. Without a sacrifice, there was no favor. The logic was stark transactional and ruthlessly efficient pure Babylonian commerce. This identical twisted reasoning governed the institution of marriage. A new union demanded approval from the principalities ruling the air. Children were the expected return on investment. The continuation of family bloodlines depended entirely on fertility, so the priesthood set their price. And let me tell you that price wasn't livestock or gold. It was the bride herself. You need to place yourself inside the mind of that terrified 16-year-old girl. Your entire existence from the moment you were born has been a training camp for silence and submission when men are speaking. You have been programmed with the proper posture, the correct walk, the acceptable way to welcome guests, to pour the wine, and to address your elders with total compliance. You understand completely that your worth in this system is tied to your family name, your physical body, and your capacity to produce male heirs for the lineage. You know your marriage is about political alliances and property acquisition, not love. But absolutely no one prepared you for the horror of what comes next. No one explained that before you belong to your husband, you have to be handed over to a third party taken to an undisclosed location. No one warned you that your first night bearing the title of wife will not involve your husband at all, but strangers in robes. The attendants guide you through your father's doorway, pulling you away from the drunken laughter of your husband's companions. They gaslight you, explaining you're just going to the temple for a blessing. They never speak the word purificatio out loud. They never reference the legal statute that permits this trafficking. They lead you through the winding dark streets toward the hill where the Temple of Bona Dea dominates the skyline, imposing and dignified, cloaked in fake reverence and civic honor. The flames are dancing in bronze holders at the entrance, setting a hypnotic stage. Public altars line the exterior steps looking holy. Nothing about this scene disturbs the average sleeping Roman observer. Every citizen has witnessed these sights countless times and thought nothing of it. But what no citizen has witnessed is the darkness that lies beneath the surface. For generations, those underground spaces remained invisible, hidden from the public eye. Ancient writers barely acknowledged their existence, fearful of the repercussions. Later authors attempted to scrub history and eliminate what little description survived, but the stone cries out. Stone outlasts every censor and every cover-up. When modern excavators finally started probing beneath the major temples of Rome, they discovered architectural features that defied every established category of archaeology. These were not burial chambers for the dead. They were not storage facilities for grain. They were not structural foundations or water cisterns. These were processing centers rooms engineered for human bodies to be delivered, utilized, and removed like cargo. Beneath one temple after another, the same disturbing configuration emerged. Cramped staircases descending straight into the darkness. Doorways framed with heavy stone, fitted with locks that operated only from the exterior. These were prison cells carved directly into living rock. Some contained shallow stone platforms sized precisely for a human form, their surfaces worn smooth from repeated ritualistic use over centuries. Others featured channels cut deep into the floors to direct liquid drainage away from the platforms. You know exactly what kind of liquid that was. There was no decorative artwork, no family dedications, no evidence of ordinary domestic activity. These spaces served a single horrific function: absolute control. Back in 2003, excavators working beneath the Temple of Bona Dea on the Aventine Hill broke through into one such chamber that had remained virtually untouched since ancient times. Accumulated soil had filled the space over the millennia, but the architecture survived intact, preserving the crime scene. Two stone platforms stood parallel to each other, each equipped with those chilling drainage channels we talked about. Iron hardware remained embedded beside the doorframe and the walls. And finally, the walls shattered centuries of enforced silence. Instead of carved hymns or mythological scenes praising the gods, the plaster surfaces were covered with scratched names, the desperate cries of the victims. Imagine walking into a dark, forgotten chamber and seeing the writing on the wall, literally. We are talking about row after agonizing row of female names etched deeply into the cold stone by trembling human hands, and every single one of them was stamped with a specific date. When you analyze the timeline, you realize there was no coincidence here. These dates were not random scribbles. They lined up perfectly with the Roman wedding seasons and the pagan festival calendars, revealing a systemic machine of ritual abuse operating in broad daylight. It took a determined British archaeologist named Catherine Johns years of digging through the dirt and the lies to catalogue these inscriptions, cross-referencing them against the few surviving records that the elites forgot to burn. Now, when she finally published her findings, she had to play the academic game. She used the cautious, sterile terminology required to keep her career carefully dancing around the horrific truth of what she found. She wrote that these names most likely belonged to young women who underwent a so-called ritual process in that dungeon strictly connected to their change in marital status. She did not go any further than that. No explicit descriptions of the horror, no graphic details of the trauma, just a sterile observation of an ancient crime scene. But family, you have to read between the lines. When you put that physical evidence next to the Roman laws mandating purification, and you look at the absolute power granted to the priests of the Bona Dea cult, the puzzle pieces snap together to reveal a demonic picture. We are going to speak the brutal truth right now that no Roman citizen dared to whisper for fear of their life. Before a marriage was considered legal in the eyes of the state and their pagan gods, before the covenant could be sealed, the bride had to be physically surrendered to the priesthood. These agents of darkness claimed the chaotic first right to her body, hiding their perversion under the religious mask of spiritual purification. Only after they were done with her was she delivered to her husband as cleansed. And let me tell you, this is not conspiracy theory or speculation. This is historical fact. The Roman authors themselves left us breadcrumbs, even though the scribes and copyists worked overtime for centuries to scrub the record clean. Look at the playwright Plautus, a man famous for his comedies writing way back around 200 BCE. In one of his plays, which was heavily edited by the censors later on, of course a character drops a bitter dark joke about what really happens on wedding nights in Rome. We have a surviving fragment that goes something like this. The gods always claim their portion of the flesh before any husband dares to touch it. That is just the way the world works. His friend replies with a heavy heart. And what exactly does the bride get out of this deal? The answer is chilling. If luck is on her side, she leaves purified. But listen to this one early manuscript that slipped through the cracks, had an extra line. It said, "If fortune does not smile, she never leaves at all." And guess what? That line was erased from every single copy made afterward. Fast forward 100 years, and you have the philosopher Lucretius writing in the 1st century BCE, and he was not afraid to push the envelope even further. He went on the offensive against the Roman superstitions and the way the elites weaponized religion to justify their absolute cruelty against the people. In a passage that the medieval monks tried to scrub from existence, he described the rites of the Bona Dea cult as something called sacred by the priests, but experienced as pure terror by the women. He boldly accused the priesthood of stealing the very thing they claimed to be offering up to heaven, hiding their theft and debauchery behind the word divine. By all accounts, that passage should have been thrown down the memory hole and vanished forever. It only survived because God allowed a single copy to escape the censorship machine, and it was miraculously recovered in 1417 inside a dusty monastery library. When you put these fragments together, you see the demonic machinery locking into place. The law defined women as property, and the law demanded that this property undergo a purification ritual. The state assigned that duty to the priests. Priests who served a cult obsessed with fertility bloodlines and the control of female bodies. They built physical facilities, actual underground chambers, engineered specifically to receive and restrain one victim at a time. We have researchers finding names scratched on dungeon walls matching wedding dates. We have a playwright mocking the sick custom. We have a philosopher denouncing the evil. Yet the system kept on rolling because every part of this wickedness was protected by the armor of sacred religious language. Now go back to that father standing at his front door. He knows exactly what the requirement is. He has known the score since he was a young man himself. He has absorbed the horror stories that his wife whispers in the dark, but will never dare repeat in front of their innocent daughter. He has seen the other brides coming back from the temple district, their faces pale as ghosts, their bodies stiff with trauma, their eyes empty and void of life. But the law does not care about his feelings or his conscience. It demands his total submission. If he tries to protect his daughter, her marriage becomes legally void, and the contract is broken. His family's carefully built alliances would crumble to dust. His reputation in the community would suffer permanent, irreversible destruction. And worse than that, he would face prosecution for impiety charged with obstructing a sacred rite of the gods. So like so many today, he does absolutely nothing. He stands there paralyzed, fists clenched behind his back in silent rage, while the temple attendants guide his only child out into the dark night. You have to ask yourself why the husbands tolerated this arrangement. Why would any man on earth accept that another man, just because he is wearing priestly robes, gets to touch his bride Bowie before he does? The answer is not complicated, folks. It is spiritual conditioning. He grew up inside the same beast system. He was brainwashed to believe this was natural, that it protected his household, and that the divine powers required this sacrifice. The priests assured him that anyone who challenged the ritual would bring down the wrath of the gods who controlled fertility and the bloodlines of his descendants. They never used the word violation or abuse. They used the word purification. They never spoke of rape. They spoke of sacrifice for the greater good. And once you label a practice as sacred, it becomes untouchable by the common man. So, the cycle of abuse continues unbroken and unchallenged. It starts with the ceremony, the celebration, the laughter and the music, the beautiful facade. Then comes the quiet walk toward the temple, steps descending deep into the earth, a heavy door that locks from the outside, and a priest who looks you in the eye and insists he represents heaven while doing the work of hell. And in the center of it all, a girl who was never told what the word purification actually meant until it was too late. This is the history they do not teach you. And as we look at 2026, the spirit behind it hasn't changed a bit. You will not find the full truth in the official history books because the powers that be made sure to scrub the record clean. After those heavy doors sealed shut, the elite went to great lengths to burn, scratch out, or bury any evidence that might expose the darkness of their rituals to the public eye. But despite their best efforts to sanitize history, the evidence survived. It lingered in the cold stone dungeons beneath the earth, hidden within the fine print of ancient legal codes and tucked away in the fragmented lines of plays that were actually warnings in disguise. The truth also echoed in the furious writings of a lone philosopher who had the courage to document what the rest of society was too terrified to even whisper in the safety of the dark. If you want to understand how this demonic system has managed to survive and adapt over thousands of years, right up to 2026, you have to look closely at the infrastructure the Roman Empire built. I am not talking about what they did to the physical bodies of these women, which was horrific enough, but rather how they systematically dismantled their voices and their spirits. This is the point where the story shifts from simple brutality into something far more calculated and sinister. We are talking about a silence so profound that it was legislated into existence by the highest courts of the land. People always praise Rome for its engineering marvels, but its greatest achievement wasn't the highways stretching across continents or the aqueducts moving water through mountains. The true genius of the Roman beast system was absolute unyielding control. They sought total dominion over the physical body. Yes, but more importantly, they demanded control over the language itself, dictating what could be spoken and defining exactly what truths would destroy you if you dared to let them slip past your lips. Once the corrupt priesthood had hijacked the institution of marriage and cloaked their twisted practices in holy terminology, they locked the door and threw away the key. The next step in their agenda was logical and inevitable. They transformed speaking the truth into a criminal act, making it not just socially awkward or improper, but a crime against the state. It wasn't just about being embarrassed, it was about being destroyed by the legal system. Go back to the year 169 BCE. And you see the blueprint being laid out. The Roman politicians passed a statute known as the Lex Vaconia. On the surface, they claimed it was just about inheritance taxes and managing wealth distribution, standard bureaucratic nonsense. But that was just the cover story. Buried deep inside that legislation was a trap, designed to gag women, imprisoning them in a fortress of silence regarding the dark mysteries of their religious cults. If a woman dared to expose the gears of the machine, if she revealed what actually happened during those sacred ceremonies, she was hit with charges of impietas, which means treason against the gods. To modern ears, that word might sound like some abstract theological debate, but let me assure you, there was nothing theoretical about it in the ancient world. Impietas was a weaponized accusation that ended lives. The punishments handed down by the state were absolutely savage and demonic. If you were lucky, you got exile. That meant being ripped away from your children, your home, and your identity dumped in a wasteland to rot and die alone while the world forgot you existed. Then there was the financial destruction. They would seize every asset, turning a noblewoman into a destitute beggar before the sun even set on her trial. In the most severe cases, the penalty was execution. The message from the establishment was loud and clear. You do not speak about the horrors that take place in the underground tunnels beneath the temples. You do not describe the so-called purification rituals. You do not verify the rumors. You don't even acknowledge they exist. You maintain absolute total silence, or the empire will enforce that silence permanently. And this threat didn't just apply to the young brides caught in the web. The net was cast wide. It trapped every woman who had ever walked down those stairs, every handmaiden who led them there, and every doctor or midwife who had to witness the aftermath. This satanic system did more than just break bones and bruise flesh. It wrapped legal chains around the tongues of the survivors. So, when you hear historians today whining that the records are fragmentary or unclear, don't be fooled, it wasn't bad bookkeeping. That emptiness in the archives is the result of centuries of deliberate government-mandated cover-ups. It is a manufactured silence designed to protect the guilty. The male writers of the time loved to hint at these secret women's rights. You can feel the smug satisfaction and arrogance in their words. They praise these women for their discretion and discipline, which is just code for their ability to take the abuse and never say a word to the outside world. They pat the corrupt priesthood on the back for keeping the rituals pure and untainted by public scrutiny. They boast with arrogant pride that certain ceremonies are so holy that common men aren't even allowed to see them. It is the ultimate secret society. But here is the one thing they never tell you: what actually happens to that terrified 16-year-old girl when she is marched down that dark staircase. They hide behind empty words like sacred obligation and ancient custom, acting like those phrases justify the darkness they are protecting. But here is the thing about the truth: it is like water. You can't hold it back forever. When you can't speak openly, the spirit finds a way to crack the walls. People find other ways to leave a warning for the future. Fast forward nearly 2,000 years to the modern era where the stones finally began to speak. In the 1920s, archaeologists digging through the ashes of Pompeii found a villa that looked on the surface just like all the others. It had the fancy painted rooms, the courtyards, the household shrines, just another snapshot of daily life frozen in time by the wrath of Vesuvius in 79 CE. But then they found something that didn't fit the narrative. There was a doorway that led nowhere. Just a dead end blocked by solid brickwork. Someone right before the volcanic catastrophe had deliberately walled off this specific room to hide it. So, naturally, the excavation team broke it open. Inside, the air was stale, untouched for centuries. And there on the wall, preserved perfectly in the dark, was a fresco. At first glance, it looked innocent enough, boring even, just a standard piece of art. It showed a classic Roman wedding. You had the bride under her veil, the groom standing there, holding hands in the traditional covenant style, surrounded by witnesses. It was respectable. It was legal. For a moment, the researchers thought they had just found another piece of domestic art celebrating family values and Roman pride. But then someone looked past the happy couple. They looked deeper into the background details. Hidden in the shadows behind the joyful marriage, almost camouflaged by the painted pillars, was a second scene. It was small, designed to be missed by the uninitiated. But there it was, in the shadowed corner, a young woman being dragged down a staircase by hooded figures. The truth was painted on the wall the whole time. Her body was contorted, twisting backward against the gravity of the descending stairs, as if her very spirit was fighting to stay in the light of the living world. Her gaze was locked upward, fixated on a man standing at the summit of the steps. He reached out an arm toward her, yet his feet were planted like stone, offering no real salvation. He didn't chase after her, he simply observed the descent. It is striking to note that the creator of this piece poured far more soul and technical skill into her terrified countenance than into the generic smiling bride standing in the forefront. You can see the etching around her eyes, the tension locking her jaw and the white-knuckled desperation as her fingers clawed at her robe. It screams of fear, confusion, and a betrayal that cuts to the bone. These weren't just brushstrokes. These raw emotions were chiseled into the plaster with a violence and intensity that still resonates 2,000 years later. Even the researchers excavating the ruins of this fallen empire noticed something deeply unsettling about the scene. The artistic mastery of this hidden shadowed corner far surpassed the central image, with brushwork that was surgical in its precision. The shading and depth revealed a level of sophistication that was seemingly out of place for a mere background detail. It becomes clear that the artist intended for the darkness of the background to burn into the memory longer than the main event. And then there is the mystery of the wall itself. Sometime before the judgment of fire rained down on the city, someone made the conscious choice to brick this room up. Not to paint over the crime, not to scrape it away, but to seal the witness inside the house like a time capsule. Why go to such lengths? Because in a beast system where speaking truth is a crime and writing it down is a death sentence, a painting hidden in the dark becomes the only way to smuggle the truth past the gatekeepers. A mother who survived these pagan rituals or watched her daughter get dragged away by the powers that be couldn't just stand in the Roman Forum and testify against the elite. She had no recourse, no way to file a grievance with a legal system designed to oppress her. She couldn't publish her testimony for the public, but she could commission an artist or pick up the brush herself to leave a permanent record. She could bury her witness in layers of pigment and plaster, lock it behind a masonry wall, and pray that the Most High would let time reveal what the corrupt laws of men refused to acknowledge: the exposure of the truth. And understand this fresco wasn't the only breadcrumb left behind by the silenced voices of that era. We have found graffiti scratched into the darkest corners of imperial buildings, rough, angry lines mixing their false idols with curses hurled at the so-called holy men running the system. We find collections of broken household items, specifically figurines of women with shattered limbs left as a testament to the brutality. We see miniature staircases and tiny doors buried inside domestic shrines acting like spiritual hexes or private curses against the wickedness in high places. Now, the establishment museums won't put labels on these artifacts explaining that they are references to the trauma of purification rituals. But when you line these objects up next to the legal text and the archaeological reality, the pattern is too obvious to ignore for anyone with eyes to see. The violence inflicted on these women was real, and the silence surrounding it was mandatory under the penalty of the state. Yet the memory of the bloodline leaked through, regardless encoded in symbols and hidden images, while the public face of Roman marriage remained polished, dignified, and deceptive, much like the systems of Babylon we see today. There is one specific detail that has confused the history books for generations of scholars. It concerns the veil. Roman brides wore a brilliant flame-colored covering called the flammeum, and everyone knew it held significant power. Everyone agreed it was a heavy symbol, representing modesty, purity, or a transition of power. But here is what baffled the academics. In countless historical accounts, this heavy veil was not removed even when the couple entered the bridal chamber for the first time. The husband might lift it for a split second to shake hands during the ceremony, but once she was handed over to him, he didn't strip it away to consummate the marriage, which makes zero sense to the carnal mind. For centuries, the commentators wrote this off, insisting it must be an exaggeration or just a misunderstanding of the text. They argued that surely no man would spend his first night with his new wife without ever looking upon her face. They assumed this was just poetic language about extreme modesty, interpreting the ancient texts too literally. But then someone finally decided to look at the medical receipts with spiritual discernment. In the 2nd century, a physician named Soranus wrote a massive encyclopedia on women's health. Now, Soranus wasn't trying to be a whistleblower or expose the religious abuse of the empire. He was simply writing a practical manual on how to heal women's bodies, manage pregnancies, and treat physical trauma. But buried deep in a section for newlyweds, he mentions a condition that Roman doctors were seeing constantly. He talks about brides showing up on their wedding night or the morning after displaying undeniable signs of recent severe trauma. He describes bruising, tearing, swelling, and a spirit of fear so overwhelming that it physically prevented them from being with their husbands. And then he drops one sentence that completely flips the script on what we thought we knew about the veil. The flammeum, he notes, casually serves a double purpose. Yes, it protects modesty, but it also blocks the husband from seeing the marks of the rituals ensuring domestic peace. In plain English, the veil is there to blind the man to the evidence of what the system did to his wife before she was ever released to him. That isn't modesty, family. That is a cover-up. That is concealment of a crime. So, reconstruct the scene with this new revelation. The bride stumbles back from the temple, her steps heavy, her complexion drained of life. The handlers rearrange her hair, fix her dress, and pull that flame-colored veil down tight to hide the bruises and the pain. They push her through the doorway of her new life, acting like everything is normal while the husband waits inside, eager, confident, and drunk on the wine of the culture. He has absolutely no knowledge of the hell she just survived in the underground chambers of the elite. Nobody ever sat him down and told him the real score. Like most guys operating in his tax bracket, he's just got a fuzzy idea of these ancient traditions, probably taking a twisted kind of pride in the fact that his wife has been spiritually cleansed by the powers that be. He definitely isn't connecting that fancy religious terminology with the reality of physical trauma and bruises. So he walks her into the bridal suite, the room all set up for the big night. The lighting is dimmed way down low to set the mood. She's still all covered up veil over her hair, hiding her cheeks, obscuring her eyes. Maybe he lifts that veil up a little bit to sneak a peek. Maybe he leaves it be. But the one thing he absolutely is not doing is checking under the hood. He isn't examining her body to see what's really going on underneath those layers. When her hands start shaking, he chalks it up to her being shy or nervous. When she goes completely numb and checks out mentally, he interprets that as her being modest and pure. If she flinches when he reaches out to touch her, he assumes she's just inexperienced. And even if his gut tells him something is terribly off, what is he supposed to say? What question could he even form in his mouth? Did the holy man hurt you? You can't ask that. Even saying the words out loud would sound like blasphemy against the entire system. You have to understand this entire civilization is rigged specifically to stop that question from ever being asked. From the outside looking in, the Matrix looks perfect, totally seamless. Fathers hand over their daughters because they are terrified of being socially destroyed or sued into oblivion. Husbands buy into the ritual because they think it's a sacred debt they owe to the divine authorities. And the priests, they claim they have a mandate straight from heaven to do whatever they want behind those locked doors. Women are facing threats of being exiled or executed if they breathe a word of it. The doctors write up these cold clinical reports without ever putting a name to the cause of the injury. The artists hide the truth in the background of their paintings. The law labels the whole mess as religion and drops the hammer on anybody who tries to debate it. But you know how pressure works. Over time, the cracks start to widen. Not in the official paperwork which they kept on lock, but in the spiritual atmosphere, the emotional pressure cooking underneath the surface. You cannot systematically crush the spirits of half your population and think there won't be a reckoning. Sure, some women collapsed under the weight and just submitted to the programming. But others, they started resisting through the only frequencies they could access. We're talking secret codes in artwork, whispers in the marketplace, personal rituals that mocked the official ceremonies or flipped the script entirely. And there were some men guys like Lucretius who were red-pilled enough to look at the system and call it exactly what it was. It was theft masquerading as holiness. But the machine kept grinding on, operating smoothly from way back in 300 BCE. Even when the government changed and they moved into the imperial era, this requirement for purification stayed stuck right there in the Roman marriage laws. If you looked at the walls of those chambers, the names scratched there spanned generations. We are talking hundreds of brides, thousands of lives, maybe even more than that. Every few years, a scandal would blow up. Someone would spill the tea, revealing too much. Maybe a priest got too arrogant and crossed the line, even beyond the crazy immunity he already had. And the state, the government responded the same way every single time. Punish the whistleblowers. Tighten up the security clearance. Praise the gods, they'd say. This practice survived wars, famines, political overthrows. It outlived the republic itself. So what finally broke the spell? It wasn't a debate on the Senate floor. It wasn't some legal reform handed down from the top because the politicians suddenly grew a conscience. Systems of control like this do not just fall apart on their own. They have to be forced to crack open. In Rome's case, it took something the establishment never saw coming. A new spiritual force that called their gods fake and exposed their rituals as straight-up corruption. This new movement insisted that the bodies of the vulnerable were not currency to be traded or offerings to be used. When that movement hit the streets, Rome reacted the way the empire always reacts: persecution, torture, and death sentences. But here is the thing about truth: ideas are harder to kill than people. And this time, for the first time in history, the victims of this purification had allies ready to stand up in public and call the whole system an abomination. That is where we are heading next, straight into the collision course between Rome's sacred violence and this revolutionary new faith. It promised purity without the need for corrupt priests and sacrifice without creating victims. It threatened to drag everything hidden in those underground dungeons right out into the daylight. Now, when this new faith finally arrived in Rome, it didn't march through the big temple gates with a parade. It crept in through the back door, through the alleyways, through rented rooms above bodegas, through dirty workshops where the elites never bothered to look. It passed in whispers between slaves working the graveyard shift. It traveled quietly between women waiting in line for bread at the market. It spread from the lips of soldiers, widows, and runaways, the people the system forgot. It didn't start with political power. It started with the people Rome considered disposable trash. At first, what they heard sounded completely impossible. A god who didn't need you to constantly bleed for him to stay happy. A god who didn't demand bodies or blood sacrifice just to keep a household safe. A god who, according to his followers, had already offered himself one time so that nobody else would ever have to be offered again, to Roman ears that sounded weak. No ritual knives, no government-approved priests, no complicated ceremonies, just one man executed like a common criminal carrying a message that hit the empire right in its softest spot. Whatever you do to the least of these, the weakest among you, you are doing it to me. In the small house gatherings that formed around this story, something happened that had never happened for Roman brides before. Women started speaking up. Slaves started talking. They confessed exactly what had been done to them under the banner of purity and the gods. And instead of being ordered to shut up and take it, they were told something revolutionary. That was not your fault. That single sentence cut straight through centuries of Roman programming and lies. Rome had engineered a twisted societal matrix where the victim was perpetually gaslit into believing they were the ones in need of spiritual cleansing. But these radical new believers stood up and shouted the exact opposite truth. They flipped the script entirely, declaring that the predator, the one wielding power to abuse and destroy, was the true sinner in the eyes of the Most High. No amount of ritual washing or empty ceremony could ever scrub that stain of wickedness into holiness. This rising fire, called Christianity, wasn't just some passive philosophy or mental assent. It came crashing in with non-negotiable laws regarding sexuality that launched a direct frontal assault on the demonic infrastructure Rome had spent centuries building. It laid down a revolutionary decree that shook the foundations of the empire. A woman's body was the temple of the Holy Spirit, not a piece of chattel property to be traded by men. It drew a line in the sand, proclaiming that marital intimacy was a sacred covenant exclusive to husband and wife. It boldly called rape a heinous sin and a crime, refusing to let the elites disguise it as a holy sacrifice anymore. It exposed the darkness, condemning temple prostitution and those so-called sacred rites for what they truly were. Organized systemic abuse masquerading in expensive religious costumes to fool the masses. At first, the Roman elites just laughed, thinking it was a joke. But that laughter quickly turned to trembling fear when they realized the people listening most intently were the very ones Rome needed to keep silent and oppressed. We are talking about women, the enslaved, the poor, the exact demographics, the system targeted to force into religious servitude or ritual duties whenever the high-ranking men needed a fresh body to offer up to their idols. She could walk into one of these underground gatherings and hear words that shattered her chains. "You were used. You are not the sinner. They are the guilty ones. The judgment is on them." She could step into the waters of baptism and be washed clean. She could be declared righteous and restored by the blood of the Lamb without some creepy pagan priest ever laying a hand on her again. That message was more dangerous to the stability of Rome than any invading barbarian army or military force. The deep state of that time responded with the only language tyrants understand: trumped-up charges, kangaroo courts, and public executions. They weaponized the legal system using the same category of crime, meant to silence whistleblowers, about secret rites, impietus, or treasonous disrespect toward the gods, and hurled it at the Christians. If you refused to bow down and offer incense to the image of the emperor that was labeled impietus, it was the ancient version of being cancelled and branded an enemy of the state. If you dared to call their ancient demon gods false idols, that was impietus. If you denounced their temple rituals as moral corruption, they slapped you with impietus. The list of punishments looks frighteningly familiar to anyone studying history: indefinite imprisonment, brutal torture, exile from society, and death. Rome knew exactly how to use intimidation to keep the population in check. But this time, the spirit of the age hit a brick wall. The victims refused to stay silent. They wrote manifestos, they preached on street corners, and they spread the truth like wildfire. They told the legendary stories of those who refused to participate in the pagan machine and paid for it with their lives. Some of the most celebrated early virgin martyrs in history are famous for exactly this reason. These were young women ordered to hand their bodies over for public or temple rituals who looked the empire in the eye and refused to be used even when threatened with the most horrific torture imaginable. While the specific details in their accounts might be clouded by centuries of legend, the central message cuts through the noise like a double-edged sword. They establish that there exists a divine line, a boundary that no priest, no father, no husband, and no government official has the right to cross. This was a direct spiritual assault on the logic underlying those purification chambers. While Christians remained a minority, their impact was contained. But by this point, Rome was already fracturing from the inside out. The empire was facing the judgment of God. Political chaos, embarrassing military disasters, sweeping plagues, and total economic collapse were tearing society apart. In times of shaking like that, people start questioning the systems they blindly accepted. They asked, "If these ancient gods have so much power, why is our empire disintegrating before our eyes? Why are these sacred rituals protecting absolutely no one? Why is the sky falling while we sacrifice to idols? Why do the priests get wealthier and fatter while our streets are filled with corpses and starving children?" Christian leaders hammered that point home relentlessly, exposing the hypocrisy. They composed fiery speeches and circulated letters exposing pagan cults as nothing more than dens of sexual corruption and demonic activity. They specifically targeted the fertility rites and the secretive women-only mysteries, tearing down the veil of secrecy that protected these elite circles. They claimed, sometimes with cold hard facts, sometimes with rhetorical flourish, that these ceremonies were nothing but a pipeline transforming young girls into property for lecherous priests. They demanded a new standard of purity, one that did not require you to surrender your daughter to dirty old men wearing sacred robes in the name of tradition. Slowly, painfully, but surely they took ground in the spiritual realm. By the early 4th century, what seemed impossible finally happened. An Emperor Constantine bowed his knee and converted to Christianity. Now that didn't instantly erase the old Babylonian system overnight. The pagan temples still stood tall on the corners. The ancient priesthood still claimed their deep-seated privileges, but the spiritual atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The men who once drafted laws to protect this sacred abuse now had to share the halls of power with bishops who absolutely despised everything those temples represented. The struggle moved from the Colosseums into the legal codes, becoming a war of legislation and public policy. Imperial edicts began dismantling pagan practices piece by piece. First came restrictions on blood sacrifices, then prohibitions on specific demonic festivals, then funding was cut, and finally outright closure orders were issued. By the reign of Theodosius, at the close of the 4th century, the official position of the state was uncompromising and clear. There would be no more open pagan worship whatsoever. The era of public idolatry was legally dead. Temples were seized by the state, stripped of their gold, or transferred to the church. The massive wealth that once financed these dark rites now funded basilicas and the residences of bishops. For the priests of cults like the Bonadea, this was effectively a death sentence for their entire way of life. Their legal authority to purify brides depended entirely on state support. Their control over those temple spaces relied 100% on imperial protection. Once you remove those foundations, the entire demonic structure collapses in on itself. Suddenly, fathers had another option for their families. They could arrange a Christian marriage blessed in a church by a bishop who condemned the old rites and preached the sanctity of the home. They could finally call those underground chambers what Christians had been calling them for decades: prisons, not sanctuaries. No law compelled them to surrender their daughters to the darkness first. Of course, that doesn't mean every abuse ceased overnight. Evil is persistent, but the systemic stronghold was broken. Human nature is a creature of habit, and old ways don't die easy. You better believe that when the lights went out on the pagan world, those high priests didn't just pack up and retire. Many of them took their dark arts underground, keeping the flame of their secret societies burning in the shadows. Entire bloodlines remained terrified, clinging to these demonic covenants in the privacy of their homes because they were paralyzed by the fear of retribution from these fallen entities masquerading as gods. But the spiritual atmosphere had shifted, and the hedge of protection was gone. The law, which had once been their greatest weapon, was no longer standing guard to protect their wickedness. This entire beast system, which had successfully cloaked perversion in robes of righteousness for centuries, was finally stripped naked. The legal armor fell, and the physical decay of their temples followed suit. With the official sanction of the state dissolved, those subterranean torture chambers beneath the temples became spiritual wastelands. They filled them with debris, literally burying the evidence of their crimes to prop up the new world being built on top of the rubble. Some of these pits were turned into root cellars or graves for the martyrs, but in other places, the people finally woke up. Mobs fired up by the truth raided these strongholds of paganism and smashed every idol they could lay hands on. It was a total cleansing. Stone gods were pulverized, altars of sacrifice were overturned, and the walls of oppression were breached and broken down. You do not need a degree in history to figure out what happened in those basements when the righteous anger of the people finally boiled over and the system lost control. But you can smash a statue easier than you can heal a mind. The trauma inflicted on the collective psyche of the nations was a scar that refused to fade away. For generations, the early writers of the faith went on the offensive. They exposed these pagan cults for exactly what they were: centers of debauchery, ritual, sacrifice, and systemic violation dressed up as worship. Now, secular historians might say they were being dramatic or exaggerating, but let's be real. Beneath the rhetoric was a horrifying, solid truth that had been suppressed for ages. The marriage of state power and false religion had birthed a machine of horrors that ran for centuries. You can feel the righteous indignation burning through their parchments even today. These weren't just stories, these were confessions. They sat with broken women and shattered men who had been chewed up and spit out by these so-called holy duties and sacred rites. They tried to warn the future. They wanted the world to understand exactly what the beast had done. But history, often controlled by the elites, did what it always does. It put a soft focus lens on the wickedness and blurred the uncomfortable facts. The grit and grime of Roman purification rituals got scrubbed from the textbooks. The names of the perpetrators were wiped from the record to protect the guilty. The architecture of abuse was paved over by new construction. Those specific legal loopholes allowing for ritual abuse were hidden inside dense, complex law codes that nobody reads anymore. Yet the spirit of what happened couldn't be killed. It survived as a dark folklore, a ghost story shape-shifting through the centuries to warn us. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and you hear whispers of feudal lords claiming a right of the first night over serf brides. Historians say that law never formally existed in most places. But that legend didn't come from nowhere. It was a distorted echo, a genetic memory of an older, darker system where the elite truly had the power to reach into your home and steal your sanctity. The actual blueprint of this evil lay dormant, buried under tons of rock and ignored texts that the world forgot. That is until the dirt started talking. Modern excavations and real scholarship started reconnecting the dots we were never meant to see. We are talking legal scraps justifying purification. We are talking about bizarre underground bunkers that do not make sense for anything but secrecy and containment. We found names of women carved next to wedding dates like cattle records and ancient medical journals documenting trauma on new brides that should never exist. Even the classical authors complained about sacred theft protected by judges. And then there are the frescoes murals bricked up behind walls because they were too revealing for the public eye. Tokens left like desperate prayers for vengeance in household shrines. Individually, they can be dismissed, but put them together, it reveals the matrix of Rome that the history books try to hide. Picture it: a 16-year-old girl descending into the belly of the beast, forced down those stairs, because the law states her body is the currency for her father's political survival. The father stands there frozen and motionless. He knows if he speaks up, the system crushes him and his entire lineage loses everything. A predator in priestly robes locks that heavy door from the outside and dares to call his perversion a service to the gods. Afterward, a veil covers the shame, so the husband remains in the dark. And the law stands ready with a sword to silence anyone who breaks the code of silence. This is the face of absolute power merging with false religion without accountability. But it also shows us what happens when the people finally resist that system with enough strength to matter. It starts with hidden art, whispered testimonies, and a realization that true justice comes from a higher throne than Caesar's. It leads to a revolution, new rules about intimacy and consent, and people deciding they would rather die than bow the knee to a system of sacred abuse. You do not have to be a believer to see the objective reality here. You just have to be honest and stop lying to yourself about the glory of Rome. A new faith arrived and called these mysteries by their true name, abominations. Once that door of truth was opened, the darkness could not fully close it again. Now in the year 2026, tourists wander those same hills, snapping photos completely oblivious to the ground they walk on. They look at the pretty ruins and move along. Most will never go deep enough to see the drainage channels cut for blood or the scratch marks of victims on the plaster. They will never read the ancient medical notes that document the destruction of innocence. They will never see the sealed fresco of a man watching a woman vanish into the underworld. But you have seen it now. You have stood in that spiritual doorway with the Father. You have felt the cold chill of those steps with the bride. You have sat in the dark chambers with the names on the walls and witnessed how the government, the religion, and the elites conspired to normalize violation as purification. And let's get one thing straight. This is not just about ancient Rome. This is about the spirit of the age. Anytime people with authority use sacred language or national security to protect themselves and silence victims, it is the same Babylonian pattern wearing a new costume. If you watch this all the way through, I appreciate you. Most people tune out when history gets this ugly and real. If you are still here, smash that subscribe button and hit the like so you do not miss the next time we rip the mask off another comfortable myth about the past. And share this with someone who is still asleep, someone who thinks Rome was just marble statues and clever senators. It is time to wake them up. It is high time we pull back the heavy curtain of deception and expose the raw, unfiltered truth of what has actually been transpiring beneath the surface, deep within the belly of the beast where the darkness thought it could hide forever.